Hello, this is Sherry Fletcher, and today our episode that we are going to be discussing is the Native Americans of Sierra County, those who refuse to be subdued. Would like to also recognize that this is part of our Centennial information that we're passing out to our county, and this would have not been completed without the efforts of Cindy Carpenter and Jay Hopkins. So welcome, and now we will go forward with the Native Americans of Sierra County, those who refused to be subdued. Where did they come from? And what happened to them? When we say Apache, what name comes to mind besides Geronimo? We know that Victorio, Magnus Colorado, Cochise, and his son were all very important leaders of their clans that lived in the Mogollon Mountains and also the Black Range. The Apaches arrived in the southwest from present-day Canada around 1400. The Apaches were warlike and nomadic who roamed the southwest, preferring to live in rugged, inaccessible mountains, but equally at home on the harsh desert. And there are two schools of thoughts on where the derivation, or we derive the word Apache. Here we see the various areas that have been marked on the maps that would have been very loose boundaries for our different tribes or clans or bands of Native Americans. Most historians do agree that Apache people history is nearly lost. The Apaches were nomadic without a written language, so therefore their history was for the most part oral tradition. But the records that are available in the mid-19th century were written by the Apaches people's foes. So we do know that their history is written by the victor, who was the white man that came into the area. Also, we know that the Chiricahua was the name taken from their stronghold in the Chiricahua Mountains in southeastern Arizona. Apache may have come from the word Zuni, Apachu, meaning enemy, or from human, word Epach, which means man. Apache called themselves Dene, or the Denes, which were the people. We know, according to Dr. Sweeney's research, that at least 4 tribes are recognized among the Bendocanes close association. 2 of those tribes were the Membranos and the Warm Springs or Ojo Caliente clan or tribe. The Warm Springs, or Ojo Caliente clan or tribe, was known as the Red Paint people, or the Chinihis, because of the band of red clay drawn across their faces. They ranged on the land between the Membranos and the Rio Grande. Their heartland was the center around the bathing pool and the clear stream that ran from the San Mateo Peak on the canyon of the Alamosa River above Canadalamosa. As we know, Canadalamosa was a Mexican town that would later be known as Monticello. When New Mexico was annexed to the United States in 1848, after the Mexican War, and for a few years with the Civil War brewing, people living in the territory of New Mexico were pretty much left alone. But things changed as the war began. So what happened to them? what happened to our Native Americans that frequented the area. In a period from 1861 to 1863, the military was said to have betrayed Cochise and treacherously murdered Magnus Colorado. After the death of Cochise in 1874, the Chiricahua Apaches struggled to survive as a people, and their relationship, because of distrust with the United States government, deteriorated further. Frequently what happened was that individuals would come into New Mexico or Arizona from the eastern parts of the United States and did not understand the culture of the native New Mexicans and the Native Americans, and they would want to move them or move the Chiricahuas from their ancestral home, and they would select areas such as the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, which had despicable conditions for individuals to live. There was disease, there was not enough food, nor clean water. Some went, but most refused to go. They wanted to flee the unhealthy conditions and the corruption of the reservation. The U.S. policy of concentration via forced marches that resulted in thousands of Chiricahua and Western Apaches to live on crowded, disease-ridden San Carlos was the thought at the time. We saw that with the Navajo when they had a forced march from their native lands to close to Fort Stanton. So this was a way of handling Native Americans after the Civil War. And there was, of course, a handful of chiefs confined in chains, and they held out in the old life and the old freedoms, and they wanted self-respect. Some Chiricahuan bands tried to stay out of trouble in the 1850s by planting fields under the supervision of federal agents. Even though it was contrary to their long-standing beliefs of being a society and of being of a culture that was nomadic in nature, they did try to work on their farms, which would be in Cochio and Palomas, but it was just something that did not work out. There was broken promises of food and protection, and therefore all sides were caught up in a spiral of violence, and there was no trust. Magnus Colorado was at that time lured into a tent over by Glenwood, by Magnus Springs, and when they got him drunk, and the American military did, and then when he tried to leave, they said that he had attempted to escape, and they shot him, and they shot some of his trusted allies that were with him in the tent. Another incident was when the soldiers killed a White Mountain Apache medicine man, and at that time Hieronymo, who was also a shaman, led a group of Chiricahua away from San Carlos. Hieronymo, being a shaman or a medicine man, that was an honor that was picked by the family, and then it was either a young man, when they went through their ritual to see if they qualified for that, that was a determination whether they would be elevated to that status in the tribe. Geronimo was one that was a natural leader, and he surrendered in Mexico, but on the way back to the United States he escaped again, and he's always regretted the surrender until his death as a prisoner of war in 1909 in Fort Sill. He never came back to his beloved New Mexico. Even the freedom-fighting activities of certain scouts were also punished. So no one no one was free, or no one was given a reprieve of, even though they helped the soldiers and tracked down their own family or their own tribe members, they were still sent to the concentration camp that started in Alabama. Some went to Georgia, and then they ended up in Florida before many of them then that survived were able to come back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Here's a picture of the Apaches at Fort Marion, which was located at St. Augustine, Florida. Here's another picture. The difficult times for the Apaches, were not used to the moisture, being close to the ocean, malaria, tuberculosis. It was a very difficult time, and they were held there in that wet, damp, cold dungeon that at one time had been built by the Spanish to hold prisoners from the 1600s. Here's a picture of Fort Marion, which is at St. Augustine, Florida. So what about the families? We've talked about what happened to them, where did they come from, and now what about the families, and what about who carries on their traditions? Some of the Indians did not follow the war, some of the Native Americans, nor did they go on the reservation. They tried to hide by adopting white names or Hispanic names, or placing their children in Hispanic families. If one goes on the census and looks at the early 1850, 1860, 1870 census, it shows how through the decades they would label themselves in different fashions to hide the fact what their ethnicity or their race was. When we have researched the recent written records, we find that many would change their ethnicity from decade to decade, but also if one looks at the census, the questions changed every decade too. But here's an example of one that has now stepped forward and has been recognized by the Ojo Caliente Chiricahuas. And if one looks at the family, one decade they notified them as white, and then the next decade they would list themselves as Mexican. Apache scouts were also taken prisoners of war and sent to the concentration camps. So who are they now? Many Apache families disguised their race on birth certificates to preserve their family and to benefit their children. After the death of Geronimo in 1909, the government allowed some families or some clans to return to the Southwest, but not to their ancestral homes at Ojo Caliente or up by Chloride or in the Mimbres. This so-called Indian school was on the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. The families returned, and many of them had been born in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, so they were integrated into the schools that were being built at Whitetail, because that was an area that the Mescalero Reservation said, and they made that available to the Native Americans the distant relatives of the Mescalero Apaches who came back to New Mexico. Families who returned were housed in uninsulated 2x4 rooms with poor furnishings. Heat was provided by heating wood stoves, and there was insufficient water systems, and so one can see where they did have some accommodations, but not to the degree as some of the other buildings that were made available in the area. Here's an example of Ramon Gourlay, who married Simona Luna in 1944. His family had resisted the government from the beginning, but chose to stay in Sierra County through a combination of hiding and deception and marking different races on their census. Families like this one today are leading the renaissance of the red paint people, or the Warm Springs Ojo Caliente Apaches. So who carries on the traditions to the future? As Apache families come out of the shadows, we will begin to gather history and reconnect the story of their people. Courageous souls who step up in the early years of the 21st century will present the history and preserve the history for the future.
We did not agree with the way they were carrying on. So four of us talked over the telephone. Two of the originators, along with Paul and I, they're not here today. They live up there around Missouri, so they could not make it. We took one phone call to Josie. I think you were there at Cherry Creek. Those of you that were at Cherry Creek was Elsie, Johnny. The first meeting, real meeting that we had was in Cherry Creek. There was 22 of us. And you can see on the back of this sign, I'm trying to keep a history of the gatherings. I don't count the meetings or anything, but from the 22 that we started with, our roles have increased to almost